reasons I wanted to do this program tonight was, I should say, over the past 8 to 10 years, what's really been bothering me is just the escalating level of hate crimes. And part of that is that, for the most part, it kind of went past our radar for a while, and now we should be confronting it day in and day out. And so I'm hoping to raise awareness that much more about where I think things have gone and where we sort of were either sleeping or assured this really wasn't the problem that we thought it was at the time. And now we find ourselves on a daily basis confronting it. And it really is time to do more than just wake up. Last month, one of the members stood before us and said he was concerned about another person that he was canvassing with, and that this person of color should have another person with him because he was concerned for his safety. And as I looked out of the crowd, I was taken aback by how many people weren't surprised with what he was saying, but only caught that he needed someone to canvass with this other person. And I think that kind of spoke to me even more deeply about how much, in my opinion, we may be either soft pedaling or in denial about how at our front doors this is. So that really just caught my attention that a member of this organization told us that, and we pretty much didn't have much of a response to it. And this is talking about canvassing in Burien. So I'm going to go through this and then certainly allow my speakers to introduce themselves. Hate in the greater Seattle area. So back in 2008, the FBI made this posting warning. It was in a number of papers, the Seattle Times, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, about hate groups on the increase in Washington State. But we were given a false low saying that most of these groups were out on the periphery, out in remote areas. They were disaffected people, and their numbers weren't very large. And we misinterpreted what was going on. In the past, these groups would only recruit sort of like-minded people who would say, yes, we're upset, we're going to go, cause a revolution and do this and do that. What's different about this is what they were able to do were recruit disaffected people with a military background. And I can tell you, I was a nurse in the military, but the training that you get, even as a nurse, if I were part of that, would provide them invaluable resource and information that in the past they never had. They would be running crazy ops and there would be TV clips about them and no one took them seriously. But that has changed dramatically because they're able to recruit people with military backgrounds who can tell them about guns and munitions and planning and staging, things and access to information they never had before. This is where we misinterpreted what this meant. One of the things that happened, and there were so many, was a trans woman was riding the bus, and the thing that caught me was that two things. This person didn't feel comfortable enough riding the bus that she had to have pepper spray in order to transit around. And that to me, I think, speaks volumes about what's going on. Anyway, got into an altercation with some teens, got off the bus, and they attacked her and beat her, and the teens were arrested. And this is just, again, a tiny sampling of what's really going on in our city and surrounding areas. Seattle has a, we don't have internet. How can we get the internet? We have to get a password real quick.
Never cracks.
Start trying.
Yes, that's not a very good start.
the Seattle Police Department has a bias hate crime data bank. Okay, thank you. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. In 2012, we were told that hate crimes were being reported at increasing numbers.
It's thinking.
And it won't tell me it works so beautifully at home, and now it won't work.
That's life.
The signal measure is not very good.
Yeah.
Well, what it should show is that these numbers were cut in half in 2012. And remember that the trend was in 2008, we were told emerging hate groups in the area. 2012, that a number of these hate crimes were on the increase. And then in 2019, we end up with a record 228 hate crimes reported in the city. And just as an offshoot, 60 of those crimes were reported by people identifying as either Black or African American, 12 of them white, 8 Hispanic, the 7 Pacific Islander, and 4 Hispanic or Latino, and then 2 identifying as Hispanic or Latino. One of the things I question is whether or not the crimes, hate crimes against people identifying as Latino or Hispanic are the true numbers, because they are more inclined not to report than to report. And there are a variety of issues and reasons. So we know that even in the city, these numbers keep going up, and it's one reported hate crime every other day or more. So that's really, a snapshot of where we are with things.
Chris, did you say that these numbers are double what the 2012 were,
Exactly,
as well
yes.
as the 2012
Yes.
being double 2008?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I was horrified to wake up one morning and listen to NPR and be told that Washington State is number 4 in hate crimes. And I don't know how many of you felt when you read that or heard that, but even greater fear went through me as I thought, this is not exactly the state I had envisioned when I moved here back in 2005. So much has changed. Let's go to work next. There you go. Yep, yes. So, 4th highest hate crime rate in 2018, and the 2019 report is due any moment. We'll see where things are. Some of the numbers suggest a slight decrease, but those numbers are statistically insignificant, which is to say that the numbers are pretty much about the same. Yes. Just will not behave the way I wanted to. I wanted to talk a little bit about Twitter. next time I bring it. Cities with more hateful tweets have more hate crimes reported. One of the things that many of us, I think, have truly underestimated is, for whatever we think about the current president, for his ills of not being a strong leader, having pretty much no business in that office at all, he is skilled at media and is given license for people to put things on Facebook and Twitter that we can't even imagine. So if we're going to get smart about the upcoming elections, one of the things we have to do is come out of denial about the role that this one platform plays, Twitter, and do something about it. It is, by all accounts, responsible for a great amount of his success in that campaign, which was to use media. He didn't have to be skillful and knowledgeable in foreign policy or any of that. He just was very masterful in using media. One of the things we learned is that the law enforcement, again, helped us with our denial by first telling us that these groups that were located in the outskirts of major cities weren't to be worried about. They were disaffected and they were minor, that they were keeping an eye on them. And now we learn that our FBI folks underestimated the true impact that they would have, and now we find them at our front door. And I think that that, again, speaks volumes to where we were, where we thought, what we thought these groups were about, and what's going on. Oh, she got One of the interesting things, and this correlates between what was going on in 2012, an election we had, and our recent election. Does anybody remember, of the 39 counties in Washington State, how many counties approved referendum 74, which was for marriage equality? Do we know how many? 3 or 4? 2? It was actually 10. So to me, the shocking thing is we were happy with the results, but when you look at it on the map, those are the counties that supported approved referendum 74, and those that rejected it were in the majority. And here is, I think, an inkling of those trends from 2008 to 12, and then we look at the affirmative action bill that was, or referendum that was before us. Does anyone want to take a guess how many counties approved that?
Which one?
The recent one on ballot, which was for I-1000 for affirmative action, absolutely. Just 5. San Juan. Yeah. And the shocking part is that I would have expected Island County to be included in that group, and they were not. So what changed between 2012, when we had at least 10 counties affirming marriage equality, and now we're just barely 5 counties for affirmative action?
Confusion.
And I think one of the things is that the language around all of this so easily creeps into our lives that sometimes we don't even know that it's there until we're confronted with something like this.
But it was like almost 50-50. Even those that rejected it fairly.
And then we have to ask ourselves, how was it possible that Matt Shea gets elected? Shea, excuse me, you're correct, Matt Shea gets elected. And we make statements like, unfortunately, who cares or what's the big deal? But it speaks volumes to not only did he get elected, not only did he have a platform to spew this stuff, his party was unclear about whether or not they should ask him to step down. Were unclear about the things that he said, whether or not that violated the tenets of the office that he swore to the people he elected. And we waited and waited and waited until a federal investigation informed us that he may have acted against the government, and he's an elected official. Something that I think, if you will, on our side, just simply spewing the few wrong words and upsetting people is enough to call, question, and ask whether or not that person is able to represent the people that they've been elected. And yet we have an entire state party that seemed paralyzed in whether or not they should take steps to say, gee, this really isn't the thing we should do, and we should really press him to step down. And I think they just only removed him from his committees.
They kicked him out of the caucus.
And he's been kicked out of the caucus.
They've asked him to resign.
And that resignation came after the investigation was put forth.
And he also got the highest number of individual donors.
So this is what we are confronted with in our city. So if we have the false sense that, yes, on one hand, people come here because Seattle is considered blue. But it seems like things are changing, and there are issues here that we hadn't confronted, and now they're sitting right there in our face. With that, I'd like to turn to our two panelists, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
My name is Monisha Harrell. I am the board chair for Equal Rights Washington, and I guess we can do more thorough introductions. I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to the 34th LD. My name is Jimena Menezquez, and I am a policy analyst with the Office of the Attorney General. Got to work with Monisha and a couple other folks, some who are in the room on the hate crimes bill that just passed during the last session. And yeah, that's what we're about to dive into.
One of the things I forgot to mention is that my panel is supposed to be much larger and has changed several times for a couple of issues. One of the issues, Iranian Americans or people of Muslim background crossing the border from Canada back into America were held up. So a couple of my panelists had to withdraw from speaking here to go help out to see if they could get them back into our country. So we're again confronted with, in our face, how much has changed, how hate is just right there and has even changed the quality of the program that we're having. And I'm grateful for the speakers that I was able to get, but that's the impact that it has had and is continuing to have.
So we were just talking about starting order, because when you're telling a story, it's kind of helpful to start from the beginning. So I will let you start a little bit. And I am not Nina Martinez, who is in the program brochure, by the way. I did work very closely with Nina on this hate crimes legislation, as well as Anti-Defamation League was really critical in this particular piece of legislation. I also worked with Nina on the Initiative 940, the De-Escalate Washington Initiative, which was the work to provide required de-escalation training, mental health training, and first aid training for all law enforcement officers in Washington State. So we've got a team that has gotten really good about working together on issues, but I will let you start.
So there was a recap that Chris just gave about the increase in reporting of hate crimes, and just to be clear, that this is information that we've started tracking more significantly over the last decade, and specifically over the last about 4 years. So our numbers on hate crimes and the reporting within Washington State are fairly novel. This is why in 2017 there was this Seattle PI report about a 42% increase in hate crimes in Washington State. There was about a 17% national increase in reported hate crimes that were linked by many accounts to the narrative that we were hearing out of the White House, and having at minimum a bully in the office. And what followed from that was this expectation of, okay, well, is this a trend that we're seeing on the increase? And the most recent report, which is the 2018 annual report by the Washington Association of Police Chiefs, Sheriffs and Police Chiefs by WASPIC, shows that it seems there was an increase from 2017 to 2018. So as egregious as the 40% increase sounds, it has gone further. And there was in the last numbers I checked, there was a 25% increase from that 42%. So that means there were 443 total reports of hate crimes that had some manner of, beyond an incident report, so there was some type of investigation and possible prosecution that followed those. And in 2018, the number is 521. Now, the next report is due in June of 2019, so we don't have those numbers yet. But one of the encouraging things as a backdrop to what is not an encouraging conversation is that this is data that's now being collected. And it's being collected more intentionally so. Part of what the new hate crime bill did during this most recent session was to update the definition of hate crimes in Washington State. At the city and county level, there were some cities that actually were ahead of the state definition. City of Seattle, notably, had updated their hate crimes statute, I believe it was in 2016. So there was already a framework for categorization of hate crimes that met more contemporary standards of identity than our state legislature had captured. And so it was a bit of a cleanup act as far as including things like gender identity specifically, and not just having that having that as a part of sexual orientation, which is how it had been originally been included within the old crime, which was malicious harassment. There are a lot of nuances to the hate crime bill that we can go as light or dive further in as you would like. But specifically, the crime of hate crime is something that at the state level is a Class C felony, so that comes with a certain set of minimum repercussions to it, if you can meet the threshold of necessary evidence for that charge. And we have kept that threshold, but expanded some of the actions and behaviors that could be categorized as hate crime. And this is important, and it was a question during legislative session as far as why is it worthwhile having very specific examples in statute of what hate crimes look like. And the reason it's important is because it gives cues to law enforcement officers when they're conducting their trainings, or when they hear a report from someone who might be in a state of panic or trauma and they haven't fully processed what happened. This is unfortunately very common when someone calls for emergency assistance, if they call for emergency assistance, that they won't identify what happened to them as a hate crime in the moment. They might think about it later, and then it's too late to report. So this is one of the reasons that including a more comprehensive approach to what constitutes hate crime made sense to have in statute so that it can be reflected in those trainings. The other piece that's really valuable that Monisha is currently working on along with several others is a set of recommendations that will be much broader than what the bill could capture. So these are recommendations that are developed by a series of really diverse stakeholders that come from all kinds of different backgrounds, including in their discipline areas. So we have education, we have faith groups, we have folks who are government actors, institutional actors, law enforcement, and service providers from the community, such as CARE, ACLU, etc. And in those recommendations, which Monisha will be more equipped to actually tell you the update on, we want to target the really difficult area of how you deal with this, for example, in the school arena. How do you differentiate between bullying and hate crimes and still walk a really fine line of not getting youth further involved in a criminal system that might be preventable, when what they're really doing is maybe mirroring behaviors that they're seeing in the adults in their communities. So that's part of what some of these conversations looked like in session. We couldn't get to an answer, so the work group has been the solution for a lot of that deeper conversation and research to take place. Now, one last piece that I want to add to this before I pass the mic on is, in my day-to-day work currently at the Attorney General's office, I'm working primarily on immigration policy through the Keep Washington Working Act. And there is undeniably a connection between the increase in what we're seeing as far as reports of hate crime incidents and the narrative around immigration. And it's not necessarily in the obvious way that you would expect, like someone is called racial slurs or is bullied in school or other things that are easier to see happening. There's a more subtle way in which it's affecting residents in Washington State, and that is by the enrollment numbers of children in schools. In fact, the fear can be so big of the threats that are perceived against their family or that might happen to their family or loved ones that we have seen nationally a significant decrease in students, primarily in K-12, so younger students, attending school. And that's primarily in the Latino population that we're seeing those numbers drop. So this is a really significant challenge for our state because it'll have much longer repercussions for years to come as far as vital members of our community not receiving the necessary education in order to participate in their community. So that's something that I wanted to just note as far as the work on immigration having a direct tie.
Thank you. So I actually did this a little wrong. I'm going to go back just a little bit. I'll introduce myself a little more. So my name is Monisha Harrell, board chair for Equal Rights Washington, and in 2015, we began to see the increase in hate crimes in the city of Seattle. We began to feel it in the community, and at that point in time, I was asked to serve as a co-chair for an LGBTQ hate crimes task force that was focused in the Capitol Hill area, which people kind of, would refer to as the neighborhood. And what we were seeing is that in the places where, especially the LGBTQ community was kind of meant to be safe, we were seeing the greatest increase of hate crimes really early. So this was 2015. We saw these increases in hate crimes beginning, really started to see them escalate in 2015. But as Chris mentioned with marriage equality, we saw huge spikes after really monumental wins for the community. So with every win, there is a sense of backlash. So particularly for the LGBTQ community, after we saw the Supreme Court validate marriage equality, we saw an immediate increase in hate crimes and particularly bullying for youth in schools. Those youth that were LGBTQ or perceived as being LGBTQ. So this is not something that just happened overnight. This is something that has been occurring for many years. So I don't want us to think that this has occurred overnight. After we won marriage equality here in Washington State, Twitter has been around for a really long time. We were able to see after the marriage equality vote in 2012, we were actually able to see where hate speech was popping up. Twitter can ping keywords that are known for hate speech. We were able to see those patterns popping up in 2012 around Washington State. One of the hottest pockets of hate speech were actually in the Vancouver battleground area in Southwest Washington. I'm going to mention that because this past year we saw a huge increase in trans violence in that same area, and we have one of our first trans murders in a number of years that just occurred this December in that area. A 17-year-old girl was murdered and found in the woods. Hate crime has not only been increasing in frequency, it's been increasing in severity. The number of cases of people being sent to the hospital or hospitalized because of these hate crimes is increasing. So hate crimes is a very wide range. It can be anything from a property attack to physical harm and violence. We're talking about a wide range, and so it's a little bit deceptive to just talk about the raw numbers. You should know that yes, the raw numbers are increasing. You'll hear some of the different stats and you'll go, wait, I thought it was this or I thought it was that. It's because these numbers are updated every year. So I can tell you from the 2017 numbers, Washington was the #2 state in raw numbers for hate crimes. We were only behind California in that year. California has a significantly larger population. This is not the thing we want to be known for. Of all of the things we want to be known for, hate crimes is not one of them. We are also known for being one of the most liberal states. If you pay attention to the rest of the country, we're a socialist hellhole, right? But we are, but we are seeing that reflected back on the communities that most need a place to be safe, that most need a place to be protected. In terms of the groups targeted, the #1 target nationally and in Washington State is hate crimes by race. There are almost 60% of the hate crimes in Washington State are against those of African American descent, Black folks. 60%. We've got the next large pot of hate crimes is religiously based. In recent years, it has been those of the Jewish faith who have been most primarily targeted, followed very closely by Muslim faith. And the third is those who are or perceived as LGBTQ. Those are the top 3 winners every single year in terms of hate crimes and hate crime attacks. Part of this legislation from this last year that we passed, and we had some legislators working very, very hard. It is very rare, you all probably know this better than anybody else, to introduce a piece of legislation and actually get it passed in the same year. It was a Herculean effort, but there was also the blessing of having our legislators who saw this steady increase and said, we have to do something about it. They have one of the biggest bullies for hate crimes in their midst, and they don't know how to handle it, right? They know that what we're dealing with as a community is even greater. And I want to thank Mayor Mata for, he was actually a huge reason in coming forward and telling his story that we were able to also get this hate crimes legislation passed so quickly. It is very hard for people who have been bullied, who have been attacked, to come forward and tell their stories. The reason we know that hate crimes are underreported is because there is a fear in reporting. It's not just, well, am I blowing this out of proportion? But is it going to matter, and is it going to make a difference? And how does that reflect on how you can handle processing all of this by coming forward, right? We know it's underreported because the majority of law enforcement agencies report 0 as their hate crime number. The report that Chris had highlighted, where they said the 2018 numbers were flat from the previous year's numbers, the thing that's not noted in the data, and this is why you have to dig into the data and it can be deceptive, 110 agencies didn't report in 2018 where they had reported in 2017. So though the hate crimes number was flat, 110 different agencies did not report their hate crimes information. Hate crimes reporting nationally, it's not required. It is optional, it is voluntary. The group that would have overseen some of the interference with this, particularly if they are not feeling safe with law enforcement, there's an FBI group that would have been responsible for overseeing that. This current administration has defunded that department in the FBI that oversees it. These are things that have happened over the last 3 years of this particular administration. We see the horrors tweeted every day, and there are things that don't get tweeted because how do you know that a budget line item in the FBI's budget was just struck? When we found out that this happened, we called Congressmember Jayapal's office and we said, we heard this is happening. We heard because we got a tip from one of the FBI agents that said, we can't come out about this for fear of losing our job, but this is happening. We went to our congressmember and said, we heard this is happening. She hadn't heard about it yet, but when they were able to dig in the budget, they found out, yes, it happened. There are parts of our society that are eroding every single day. This hate crime boom is not something that is occurring new. It's been there. It's been festering. It's now been given license to grow. It's like giving oxygen to a fire. So, just a bit of background on that. Increase in numbers, increase in severity, race, religion, LGBTQ identity. How is this showing up? We sometimes think, well, this is just a problem of age. When people die off, the hatred will die off with them. It's not true. We are actually seeing the largest resurgence in hate and bullying with youth and in schools. Since in the last 3 years, we've seen in areas that we think are pretty darn liberal, Snohomish, the city of Snohomish, matter of fact, they had a group of ASB student body officers that posed with a Confederate flag in their parking lot of their school, right? This was 2017. This wasn't the 50s. This isn't the 60s. This is what's happening now. And these kids, if you think about what it means to be a student body officer, they are so popular with their peers, they were elected to the highest positions in their schools. And this is how they're displaying themselves. I don't know how many people watch football, just, lesbian. I watched the Army-Navy game. How many of you saw the white power sign at the Army-Navy game by our cadets? These are the people who are going to go out and serve our country, and they're flashing the white power sign. I've never seen anything like that from cadets. Cadets normally are absolute best behavior. The Army-Navy game is where we're displaying the pride of our country. I've never seen it. I've never seen it that blatant. And by the way, no discipline. We're sending the message that it's not only increasing, it's not only more visible, but it's also okay. This year, I have the honor of serving on the Attorney General's Hate Crimes Work Group. This is part of the legislation that was passed this last year. The forming of a work group in order to reach into community, find out what is going on, and bring recommendations, a list of recommendations, back to the legislature. We have a one-year time frame. We have to bring legislative solutions back to the legislative body less than a year from now. This is where we need you. This is where we need your help and we need your assistance. We need you to be brave enough and bold enough to let us know when you see hate. We need your ideas, all of your best ideas, about how we combat this, because it's happening in more arenas than we can touch. It's happening in schools. It's happening in senior care centers. It is happening at work. It's happening on the bus. It's happening at Seahawks games. The lesbian couple that were beat up just because they held hands during a Seahawks game. I'm sorry, it's a football game. Again, lesbians. And allies, you're all welcome. We have to bring back solid recommendations because Washington State is leading in the wrong thing. We are leading in hate crimes, and that's not what we want to do. The other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need your advocacy, that when we bring this legislation forward, we need you to show up with your legislation. The 34th, you've got some good ones, I'm not going to lie. You've got some great ones. But it still helps to show up and to let the others know that we're watching you and that we have power. I know that all of you have power beyond the 34th. I know that you all have friends and family beyond the 34th, and we're going to need them to show up and put the pressure on their electeds. We are living in unusual times. And we're living in unusual times because normally this sort of thing, this sort of behavior would be shamed and it would be underground. And we are living in a time where it's glorified. I know that each one of you is here because you know how big 2020 is and that you are doing your part to ensure that we are not leading through hatred and that we are not letting fear get the best of us. But as we approach the King holiday, I just want to say one thing. It's also tiring. The last time I saw you, the last time I was here at the 34th was the meeting right after the election. And it was a standing room. And there was a lot of emotion and there was a lot of feeling. And it's been an exhausting 3 years. Every year you wake up to or every day you wake up to a new tweet, and it's hard to know how to process it all. So, in the words of Dr. King, if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. That's what I'm asking of you here today. You don't have to have all of the answers, and you don't have to have all of the strength. But if we're all moving forward, we actually will make a difference. We've had some huge setbacks, but we can't give up because that is exactly what they want us to do. They want to overwhelm us with the negativity so that we retreat to our corners, we lick our wounds, and we don't care for others. I have seen you, specifically the 34th, I've seen you show up in big ways. And I'm here because I know that you will show up in big ways again in 2020. And letting you know that there are a lot of people who are working on it and we are working with you. I will extend the offer that Equal Rights Washington, we're having a lobby day on February 11th. There are lots of lobby days. You are welcome to join us. We'll give you lunch, we'll give you breakfast. We will be working towards legislation to ban trans panic and gay panic as a legal defense for violence against the LGBTQ community. It is actually a legal defense. It is an affirmative defense for violence. It is a temporary insanity defense for causing harm against members of the LGBTQ community. The 17-year-old that was killed in Vancouver, that is being used right now, right? I was surprised. I didn't know she was trans. I snapped. I couldn't help myself. This should no longer be availed to people in this state as a legal defense for violence against LGBTQ people. We will be rallying to pass that legislation this year. This will be our third year introducing this legislation. And we now, unfortunately, have a murder on our hands that we need to say no more. We will continue working on the hate crimes legislation. As a member of the work group, any feedback, any information, anything that you want to share, my door is open, my email is open, my phone is open, free to share that information and take that work back. And the last thing, which ties into hate crimes, is we're working with the ADL and Latino Civic Alliance on anti-swatting legislation. If you don't know what swatting is, it is when people don't have the courage to put their hands on you themselves, but what they will do is they will call law enforcement to report an incident at your residence, so that law enforcement comes in guns blazing to hopefully murder you. It's called swatting. And so we have a bill that we're working on, anti-swatting legislation, that would criminalize people making these 911 phone calls in order to encourage violence. We've actually had a couple of high-profile incidents of it happening in Washington at the end of this last year for people who they think are activists, who they just want to shut down. What they do is they call 911 and they say, I heard gunshots in this residence. You need to go right away. And they make a 911 call, and based on that telephone call, the police think that there's something dangerous going on in there, and they bust through with the SWAT team, which is why it's called swatting. Seattle Police Department is one of the only police departments in Washington State that actually has an anti-swatting registry. So if anybody thinks that they could be a victim of swatting, you can put your address on the anti-swatting registry so that SPD will check with you first. They will try to make a phone contact or another contact with the home to check with somebody first to ensure, hopefully, that they are not being called into a swatting incident. But that is another piece of legislation that we're working on this year and that we're hoping to pass. These all stem from hate. These all stem from the same root. And so thank you for having us here today. And we know you will be part of the solution, and we look forward to working alongside you.
One of the last things I wanted to do is, one, you reminded me that in the trial of Matthew Shepard's death, that was their defense for killing him, was the fear that he was, this gay man was pushing himself on him. Fortunately, the jury didn't see it that way, but that was their affirmative defense at the time. It just reminded me when you said that. So the call to action, one of the things that just bugs me beyond belief is we have gotten comfortable with this notion of the alt-right. And the problem with that is the use of that legitimizes who they are, and it brings them on par with other advocacy groups when in fact we know they are not. So one of the call to actions is when you hear people travel down that road is to stop them up front and go, no. What you're talking about is hate and racism. Because when we get comfortable with this language called alt-right, it, in their mind, and has the effect through our media, putting them on sort of the same par of legitimate advocacy groups that are working hard to try to undo a lot of the crap that they're doing. So that's one of the call to actions I think all of us can do, is when we have these conversations, when we hear them, if you can, stop that conversation and call it for what it is. One of the things I want to point out is when we go to all the groups and places and get-togethers that we go to, look around and ask this one fundamental question: who's not there? I have to say that my wake-up call coming to this state was going downtown and being thrown out of a store because I looked suspicious. That was a wake-up call for me. So when I'm going to places that I go to and speaking or whatever it is I'm doing, I'm always looking around and asking who's not there. Because the conversation's a lot different when we all come from different backgrounds than when we all look the same. And one of the things to keep in mind when you're at your next social gathering is just take a look around and ask who's not there. Michelle Obama wrote in her book, Page 74, and this stuck with me as the experience, is that she said, but even today, and she's talking about her experience at Princeton, but even today, with white students continuing to outnumber students of color on college campuses, the burden of assimilation is put largely on the shoulders of minority students. In my experience, it's a lot to ask. This trickles down to even the numbers that when we talk about hate crimes, those are the reported numbers, not the actual numbers. And the great deal of burden that's placed on the individuals you talked about, Nisha, about telling their story, making the report, and in some cultural and religious backgrounds, it's better to keep quiet, keep your head down, and move on, and somehow it will get better. But we know now we have numbers, and they are probably the truest numbers, that it isn't getting better, that we're seeing numbers, and I hate that we're fourth in the nation on something that we never imagined. I don't think anybody in this room ever imagined that.
No, absolutely.
Oh, you're just putting it, okay.
No, absolutely, no.
So that's what I wanted to, in that, yes. We have a couple of questions.
I have a couple questions for our panelists. I just, they're, oh, thanks. Waiting for some technical help. There it is. Thank you so much. A great panel. And I just have two quick questions. First of all, from the panelists, what do you see the role of white people in terms of taking a leadership role in this anti-hate legislation? Either, in terms of leadership versus ally, if you could kind of talk about that. And the second thing is, can you talk about this issue of the prosecutorial power that some community groups will really balk at? When we talk about anti-hate legislation, one of the issues, we're talking about creating more laws, but occasionally when such laws happen or we increase the prosecutorial power of laws, minority groups end up being at the end of that, and face the brunt of that. So those are the two issues. I was just wondering if you could talk to both of those things.
So I'll address the piece on prosecutors. One of the challenges that we encountered during the drafting of the bill was actually testimony from WAPA that they struggle to bring forward charges of what was malicious harassment, what is now hate crimes, because the burden for evidence was so high. In order to showcase that the reason why an act of hate or a bias-motivated incident was committed was bias, there were a number of thresholds that you had to prove beyond a measure of doubt. I mean, it's a felony, so that also raises the burden in proving that this was a Class C felony. And from the prosecutor perspective, it was what we heard. I've never worked as a prosecutor. I'm not a prosecutor. This was the the number one barrier that they saw. There were cases where someone could be yelling racial slurs, but that maybe was an insult that they knew and they didn't mean it as the reason for the crime that they committed. And so getting past that in a trial was really difficult. Some prosecutors would not take the cases because they felt like it added undue hope to something that they felt they could not prove. So that was one of the barriers that we encountered. Now that doesn't resolve the disparity that you're talking about with the prosecutorial power. That is certainly one of the larger concerns, I think, from community groups was the notion that, well, reporting to any law enforcement actor, period, is scary enough. Calling 911, calling law enforcement, calling anyone related with the criminal system, period, is scary enough for a lot of people. And so part of the conversation revolved around, well, how do you add some equitable dimension to that? And that can look like including community partners who already are the largest service providers. Like when we talk with, for example, with the work that Monisha does with Equal Rights Washington, this is, they're service providers by and large to many community members that go to them first and develop relationships with people on their staff and board first before they trust any government actors. And I don't blame them for that. I mean, it makes sense to go with people that you trust, that you feel are gonna listen to you and understand you and won't put you in further harm when your historical experience has been harm. So training for law enforcement groups to recognize those things, to work more in equal fashion with community groups that are the service providers is a way of equalizing some of that balance. But by and large, the reports that we were hearing were more of a barriers for prosecutors to take action rather than them prosecuting overall. Although, just a quick trend that even though the majority of hate crimes in Washington State, 51% are committed by white people, there's a significant number of hate crime incidents that get reported as reverse racism by white people as well. And so that's also a disparity in how those numbers are reported and what needs to be really carefully scrutinized when we're assessing whether or not something actually constitutes a hate crime.
And I want to address what we can do. And particularly there's a need, a real need for support and how that can show up. So I'll give you an example. After the last election, I got a call from a student group at a high school in Walla Walla, and they were desperate. First of all, if you're a high school student and you call a nonprofit organization, you are desperate, because we are not the first people that kids normally come to. And they called the day after the election, and I just happened to answer the phone, and they were panicked. And they said, we just realized all the adults around us hate us. And that was hard, because they saw the election results the same as we did, right? And this was a group of students that had come together. They were LGBTQ students. They were immigrant and refugee students. They didn't know who else to turn to. They turned to each other and they're like, we need some help. We are on an island. And this is where nonpartisanship can help. I said, you're in Walla Walla? I said, there is a senator there who, I can let you know that all adults there don't hate you, and they represent you, and they'll stand up for you. And I will say that though she's on the other side of the aisle, I was able to call on Senator Walsh, Maureen Walsh, to reach out to those students to say, no, there are people in Olympia who are still fighting for you. Like, forget what you think that says, what these results say about you. The kids who saw their leaders standing in the parking lot with the Confederate flag, there was a group of parents that went to their to some of their student gatherings, and they cooked them a meal, they cooked them lunch, and they took those kids lunch and said, "We care about you, we love you." That's what needs to be done. It's kindness. People are experiencing so much heat, we need to extend kindness in order to counteract that. So what can you do? Extend kindness. If there's a group of teens, I mean, it's my field, but like LGBTQ teens going and serving, being part of a meal at a homeless shelter, letting them know that there are people out here who care about you. It's a thing that's going to keep them going. We can fight the things that we can fight legislatively, and not every problem will be solved with a piece of legislation. So if you want to know what you can do tomorrow, if you can give somebody a kind word, if you can leave them a kind note, if you can just, for my friends of Iranian background, I just sent them text messages and just said, "Hey, you're an amazing person and I love you, and let me know if you need anything." That's it. You owe me nothing. I just want you to know that if you need, there's help. We're all going to be at the front of those attacks at some point, and just extending kindness will go a long way.
We have time for one short question and answer. Anyone?
Thanks. I'm Katie Harris. I want to make an observation. Having looked at the reporting formats for different organizations, so for example, ADL, CARE, University of Washington, there's a striking omission. The reporting formats are all quite anecdotal for hate crimes. And what I think would be very helpful would be to put in a very systematic way, references which tell the organization, did this happen on that grassy strip between the sidewalk and the street? Did this happen on private property? Because I think that hate groups may be selecting organizations to target based on certain criteria that aren't being captured. So I wanted to bring that to your attention.
Thank you. With that, I certainly want to thank two guests for coming out and sharing your experience and knowledge. It's been a great discussion.